The diencephalon is the third largest region of the brain after the cerebrum. Here in aqua, the cerebellum, it is this area in green here. Now, it perhaps doesn't seem as large as it actually is, and that's because when you look in the mid-sagittal section, you're seeing the smallest region of the thalamus. There are three main regions of the diencephalon: the hypothalamus, which is under the thalamus, the pineal gland, and the thalamus. The thalamus composes 80% of the diencephalon, and it is primarily composed of two large lateral lobes, which aren't evident in the midline. And so the diencephalon is a bit more important than many people originally think if they begin their study of the brain, say, with a mid-sagittal section. The diencephalon develops as one portion of the forebrain, the prosencephalon. So if you look at how the brain develops, the rhombencephalon gives rise to the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The midbrain is derived from the mesencephalon, but the forebrain, the prosencephalon, develops into both the cerebrum and then the diencephalon. I'd like to begin with just some thoughts on the limbic system, which both the thalamus and the hypothalamus contribute to, and then get into the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pineal gland specifically. There is, one portion of my brain which is controlling the movements in this part of my arm. There's a nearby part of my brain which is controlling the feeling in this part of my arm. There are parts of my brain which control vision. But in the same way, there are parts of the brain which control anxiety or anger or fear, because emotions and drives like hunger or thirst, or that drive to put on a sweater, or sexual drives, or the autonomic functions which go along with them. So when your emotions change, when you're angry or afraid, your facial expressions change, blood distribution can change. Emotions and drives also belong in the brain, just as it is the job of some brain regions to cause movement or feeling. It is the job of some brain regions to be responsible for hunger or fear, etc. Now, if we look anatomically where these areas are, some of them are located in the cerebrum, but note not in the cerebral cortex, the outermost region there, in the parts of the cerebrum which are closer to the diencephalon. And then also parts of the diencephalon, such as the thalamus and the hypothalamus. These are kind of in the limbus between the conscious actions of the cerebral cortex and the completely involuntary brainstem. And so emotions and drives, we certainly have some role over them. But to a large degree, they are involuntary. So anatomically, if the involuntary portions of the brain are here, if the voluntary are here, this area is kind of in the middle, in a limbus between the two. And in the same way, if we look anatomically, if we look, think then functionally, we don't have complete voluntary control over emotions, but we can control them to some degree. And so there is a set of regions which includes both deep nuclei within the cerebrum, but also areas like the thalamus and hypothalamus of the diencephalon, which are part then of this limbic system. Once again, the thalamus comprises 80% of the diencephalon. So to see it, we would have to remove the cerebrum, that's the largest part of the brain, and we see these two large lateral lobes. Once again, the thalamus is smaller along the mid section. This midsection is also where it encloses the third ventricle. So there are spaces in the nervous system, which makes sense. The nervous system develops as a hollow tube. So then even in adulthood, it is still hollow with spaces, the central canal of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. So here we see two lateral ventricles, which we could number 1 and 2, but we say they're the lateral ventricles. And then they flow into the third ventricle. And the thalamus is in this vicinity under the lateral ventricles, but enclosing the third ventricle. So when we speak of the thalamus, proper, we're referring to these two lateral lobes, but it does also include a little bit of gray material, which is actually forming the lateral walls of this third ventricle where cerebrospinal fluid passes. So the thalamus is primarily these two lateral lobes. These two lateral lobes actually do meet in the midline in most individuals with a small intermediate mass, although this isn't present in 100% of the people. So here you notice this is the area where in this person's brain the two lateral halves of the thalamus joined, and the same thing here. This depression is that third ventricle where cerebrospinal fluid flows. But this connection does not have to be present, and it varies. It tends to be larger in women than in men, and more likely to be absent in men. The last I read, I didn't know that there was any significance which has yet been identified with that. So here we can see a cross-section of the brain. So notice that the thalamus is here. There's the third ventricle, the lateral ventricles. And it is mostly gray matter. The white matter of the axons has stained black in this section. So notice that this is mostly gray matter. But there is some white matter. There's a white matter which wraps the thalamus, that is known as the external medullary lamina. And then there are also tracts within this area known as the internal medullary lamina, which will then separate the thalamus into various nuclei, as I'll get to. So once again, there would be white matter around the nuclei of soma, but then also tracts of fibers inside as well. So here you can see, for example, there would be this external medullary lamina surrounding these nuclei, and then also a Y-shaped band. I know this doesn't look perfectly Y-shaped, but sorry, it's hard to work with this 3D animation program. So that's as close as I could get. So there are then bands of white matter, which would say split this anterior nucleus from neighboring nuclei. So once again, while we talk about white or gray matter mostly, there is some white matter as well, splitting the nuclei of the thalamus into anterior, medial, and lateral. While the white matter is mostly axons, there are some nuclei which actually located in the white matter in that internal medullary lamina. So here, for example, just some connections that the thalamus has. So here is the mammillary body of the hypothalamus under the thalamus, and you can see that it's connected. So for example, notice the mammillothalamic tract connects the mammillary body of the hypothalamus to the thalamus. Another area that the thalamus connects to are these basal ganglia, like the globus pallidus and the putamen. So there are connections between this deep nucleus of the cerebrum and the thalamus. But then also the thalamus can then connect to the cerebral cortex in thalamocortical tracts, which start in the thalamus and go to the cortex. But there are also corticothalamic tracts, which go in the opposite direction, starting in the cerebral cortex and ending in the thalamus. And these are actually the majority. So most of the connections that the thalamus has is actually with the cerebral cortex. what does the thalamus do? A lot. And so I have some videos which go through this in a little more detail. This is more of an overview. One thing that the thalamus does is it functions in the limbic system. And so if we were to identify nuclei, all right, so for example, if we were to go to this anterior nucleus, it's popping out of the rest of the thalamus in that animation. This anterior nucleus is involved in the limbic system, and it's connected to other areas. So both the hippocampus and fornix are included in the limbic system as well. Now, being involved with the limbic system certainly then gives the opportunity to be involved in other things as well, such as learning or memory, because it is areas like the hippocampus, which are not only limbic areas, but important for memory, the transfer of short-term memory into long-term memory. Because it's the things which are emotionally important to us, which are most likely to be remembered. And so when we think of limbic areas, we shouldn't think just this is a fear center, because then fear, ties into so many other things, memory being one of them. Here is one of the larger nuclei of the thalamus, and you'll notice here's that connection between the two halves. So this is the mediodorsal nucleus. And once again, if there is an intermediate mass, it would be in the middle of this nucleus. It's connecting to the amygdala, also part of the limbic system, but then other areas as well, like the substantia nigra of the midbrain, the prefrontal cortex, and it outputs to the prefrontal cortex and the cingulate gyrus. And it's involved in a number of things, but the expression of emotion, in addition to attention, planning, executive function, eye movements, memory, decision-making. The integration of sensory stimuli in emotion, so things that we feel like pain or touch, or these can certainly contribute to emotions, and so this mediodorsal nucleus is involved there, and the paraventricular nuclei of the thalamus, which are distinct from the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. These are also areas of the limbic system. And so we have emotions and drives, and the thalamus has nuclei which are involved in this. And so there are limbic functions associated with certain thalamic nuclei. Now, nuclei can do diverse functions, as you saw. That doesn't have to be their sole function, but that is one of the aspects of the thalamus. Another aspect is that the thalamus is often referred to as the gateway of the cerebrum. So notice where it is located, so that the somatosensory information from the body, the touch, pain, temperature, etc., these travel up the spinal cord through the brainstem, and then before getting to the somatosensory cortex, that's the part of the cerebrum where we become consciously aware of stimuli. So we realize, oh, something's touching my hand. I feel pain at my elbow, etc. Like my knee feels warm. That would all be, accomplished here. I'll mention taste at some point. Taste would be at the bottom portion here, or an association area where you could have something in your hand and not just feel that, oh, this is its weight, its size, et cetera, its texture. You realize this is a tennis ball, or this is a can of soda. An association area would do that. Well, in any case, the cerebrum has to be told. And so there are then tracks which then go to this somatosensory cortex, which must pass through the thalamus in order to get there. And so there are two tracks I'd like to begin with. So here we can see one. I've made it a little transparent so that you can see what is behind it. So this one that's more of a tan is the ventral posterolateral nucleus, and then there's a darker one behind it, the ventral posteromedial nucleus. These are involved in touch pathways. And so it is everything essentially from the neck down, the trunk, the limbs, which is traveling through the ventral posterolateral nucleus. So things like the spinothalamic tract and the medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus carrying information about touch, spinothalamic tract carrying information about pain and temperature. They go through the spinal, through the thalamus, obviously the spinothalamic tract. That is actually then in its name. Should you have a lesion here, then you would lose the ability to feel, the general senses of your hand, your foot, etc. Deep to that, notice there was this other nucleus, as I mentioned. This is going to then allow the somatosensory feeling of the head. So for example, the trigeminal nerve and others will contribute here so that just as the brain is aware when something is touching our, our elbow, for example, going to the ventral posterolateral nucleus, something touching the face, that information would travel to the cerebrum through the ventral posteromedial nucleus here. Also, the solitary tract from the medulla is going to bring taste information. And so notice that that somatosensory cortex, which I had shown you earlier on a still, had a region that corresponded to touch of the head. And then also in the same area was the gustatory cortex, which then allows the sense of taste. And so lesions in this area of the thalamus would prevent us from being able to feel our face or to taste. So the trigeminal nerve is responsible for those inputs, allowing us to feel our face. And then there are a couple of different cranial nerves which contribute to our sense of taste. So I would include the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve, all contributing to taste. So what you've just seen is that the thalamus is very important in being a relay for the general senses like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, but then also special senses like taste, and then also hearing and vision. So if we look on the underside of the thalamus, notice that there are these two small areas, the medial geniculate nucleus and the lateral geniculate nucleus. The medial geniculate nucleus is going to carry information about hearing, all right? So it's getting information from the inferior colliculus of the midbrain, which is involved in hearing, also the auditory cortex, and it then sends information out to the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe, and then the lateral geniculate nucleus next to it is getting information from the retina, in addition to other areas like the superior colliculus, for vision. And so it's not just the general senses which are being relayed through the thalamus, but also then essentially all special senses except smell. So taste, hearing, and vision are all being relayed through the thalamus. So the relay of sensory information is an important job of the thalamus. The thalamus is involved in motor control. Now, I know when we think of motor control, we're thinking of the motor cortex of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the second largest part of the brain, and also then the basal ganglia deep inside the cerebrum. But the thalamus not only serves as a relay, because these areas obviously have to talk to each other, and their connections often run through nuclei in the thalamus, but then also a lot of the areas of the cerebral cortex reciprocally connect to areas of the thalamus. So there's processing going back and forth. The thalamus is serving as more than just a simple relay. And so there is the ventral anterior nucleus here. So if we look on the lateral side, we're going to see two nuclei involved in motor function. This first one, the ventral anterior nucleus, it's getting its input from the basal ganglia, such as the globus pallidus, and then going out to the premotor area. So when we think of, not just, move my hand because I said, move my hand, but also like, how would I type? When we think of a complex motor function, this premotor area anterior to the motor cortex is involved. Well, this ventral anterior nucleus is projecting there. And so not only is the premotor cortex involved in the planning of motor movements, but also this area of the thalamus, which projects then to it. And then if that's the ventral anterior nucleus, then we have a ventral lateral nucleus, which is also getting information from motor centers, such as the globus pallidus, the substantia nigra of the midbrain, the cerebellum, and then going out to the motor cortex and premotor cortex of the frontal lobe. So the thalamus has nuclei which are involved in motor function. And when we speak of motor function, a lot of the involuntary motor actions which we do, say through the brainstem, are governed by what's called the reticular formation, a diffuse set of nuclei throughout the brainstem. And so, for example, here we can see the lateral and medial reticulospinal tracts carrying information from the reticular formation. While most of the reticular formation is in the medulla pons in the midbrain, there is a thalamic reticular nucleus kind of outside that white matter which envelops the other nuclei. And so it's getting input from a number of different areas. It outputs to the thalamic nuclei. Interestingly, that's unusual in that its output is not the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, but then a nuclei of the thalamus. It's the only nucleus of the thalamus that doesn't send efferents out to the cerebrum. You can even make it out if you look hard enough, where remember that there would be white matter, which here would stain black, which is going to wrap the thalamic nuclei. But notice that there's then some gray matter, which is lateral to that. That would then be the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, which is actually outside the others. So the thalamus does all of these functions and can serve as a relay. But we should clarify what we mean by a relay, because the sensory relays are simple. All right, they're called primary relays, where touch information is coming from the body. There's a synapse in the thalamus relays then it onto the cerebrum. But then there's also then higher order relays as well, because not only does the thalamus project to the cerebral cortex, but the cerebral cortex then projects to the thalamus, which then may project back to the cerebral cortex. So if one area of the cerebral cortex wants to send a message to another, it could then send that message through the thalamus. So the thalamus could relay information from one cortical region to another. That's a higher order relay. And so that's when we think about cognition and planning and executive function. The thalamus can be involved in this. So there are several nuclei which participate in these higher order relays, such as the lateral dorsal nucleus. Here, the darker green. It's getting input from the midbrain, the hypothalamus, and other places, and then going out to the parietal lobe and this region of the cingulate gyrus, where it's helping with the processing of somatosensory information and spatial memory. All right, and so it's interacting, it's helping with more complex processing, so it's not one of those simple relays. And likewise, here we have another nucleus of the thalamus, the lateral posterior nucleus, which is also sending input to the parietal cortex, which is also where it gets its input. So the parietal cortex talks to the thalamus, which then goes back to the parietal cortex as its output, functioning in somatosensory processing, also some visual processing. The largest nucleus of the thalamus, at least in primates, including humans, is what's known as the pulvinar nucleus. It is the most posterior of the thalamic nuclei. So you could identify it, say over the midbrain sections as pulvinar nucleus here. But that's getting information from a number of regions, including other regions of the thalamus, the medial and lateral geniculate nuclei. And then there's a lot of reciprocal connections in the cerebrum with both, there are reciprocal cortico-pulvino-cortico pathways going from the cortex to the pulvinar nucleus back to the cortex. In the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the posterior temporal lobe, doing a number of things like vision and hearing, which isn't surprising given that the input is from the medial and lateral geniculate nuclei, but then also other things which are more complex. So for example, even emotions, when we see things like a threat, that can get an emotional rise from us. And so there is interest in studying the thalamus because whether it be epilepsy, attention deficit disorder, schizophrenia, and other aspects of mental function, the thalamus is involved, and treatments which involve the thalamus can be used with patients. So here, once again, here's the midbrain, and here's the pulvinar nucleus, which is the posterior portion of those lateral lobes of the thalamus. So the thalamus, 80% of the diencephalon, has all of these discrete nuclei. Many project to very distinct regions of the cerebral cortex with specific functions. And then the same thing is going to be true of the hypothalamus, which is underneath the thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus, perhaps the size of a thumbnail, and I think it could be argued that no other region of the brain has squeezed as many vital functions into such a small area. So the control of the autonomic nervous system, many emotions such as fear, pleasure, sex drive, the sense of hunger and thirst and being satiated, the sleep-awake cycle, the biological clock, our temperature regulation, the secretion of hormones. The hypothalamus, we could just go on and on about how vital this is and how many functions have been squeezed into it. Now, this video is meant to just kind of give a quick overview into this, so I'll introduce some thoughts, but obviously the videos playing in the background go into this in a little bit more detail. So perhaps one of the ways you can realize the significance of the hypothalamus is, once again, it's such a small area, but look at how many nuclei of the thalamus of the hypothalamus are recognized. Just for just sake of orienting oneself, here in green, this is the thalamus and the fornix coming in there, where the two optic nerves cross at the optic chiasma that is located here. There is that mammillary body, which I had pointed out earlier, and then hanging from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. So just some structures around it. So there are a number of nuclei of the hypothalamus which are involved in metabolism, whether we're hungry, hungry or thirsty, and thus are involved in weight gain. Now, this can, then be, more complex. So for example, some are involved in, say, stress and corticosteroid secretion, but corticosteroid secretion affects weight gain. So when we're under chronic stress, weight gain can be associated with that. And so I'm just going to give a couple of other examples, but of all of these nuclei of the hypothalamus, there are several which have roles in various aspects of hunger and eating, etc. Now, this is perhaps an introduction into topics covered later in hormones, but there are nuclei of the hypothalamus which send hormones to the pituitary and regulate its secretion of hormones. And many of these can then affect eating and hunger to varying degrees. So this is, a more in-depth topic for later, perhaps. But if you look at all of the signals which are coming from the hypothalamus, which affect some aspect of eating or metabolism, there are a great deal. The hypothalamus and the pituitary can produce a molecule called POMC, which then gets broken into lots of little pieces, each of which serves as an independent hormone, which can then affect feeding. So one of the roles of the hypothalamus is to determine when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when we're satiated, and as we are concerned about weight gain and the problems of weight gain, certainly the hypothalamus and some of its nuclei are involved. I mentioned that there was the optic chiasma, where the two optic nerves crisscross. Over that nucleus is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the major timekeeper of the body. It involves genes, which interestingly are not just part of circadian rhythms in mammals and other vertebrates, but also going back to invertebrates. And so lots of animals try to keep a daily cycle of night and day, which we call circadian rhythms, circadian meaning about a day. So there's lots of different things we do that is about on a daily cycle. And this nucleus of the hypothalamus is the primary control region of this circadian clock. And it can be trained to our what we're seeing with our eyes as far as when it's light versus dark, because as you can see, the optic nerve then sends an offshoot to then this suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, we would have a biological rhythm even if we were, say, in a cave and we couldn't ever see light. We would still have rhythms which were about 24 hours in length, but this connection to the retinohypothalamic tract allows us to train our cycle on this cycle going on with light and day. Now, obviously, there's complexity here, and you might say, well, isn't another region of the diencephalon, the pineal gland, involved? And the answer is yes. So these neurons in the suprachiasmatic nuclei can release signals, all right, which can then go to the pineal gland. Not only can they reach the pineal gland by traveling through the cerebrospinal fluid, so signals can go through the cerebrospinal fluid from one region of the hypothalamus to another region, but then also from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, there's a relay to the superior cervical ganglion, which then goes back to the pineal gland, which affects the release of melatonin. And so melatonin is a hormone which we make at night, which informs all of the body that it's nighttime, but it was the suprachiasmatic nucleus whose signaling then was translated into the secretion of this hormonal signal. So that is an important nucleus of the hypothalamus. And there are more. So for example, the preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus is so important that it can be divided into subnuclei. Now, I didn't mention this in the thalamus, but it's true there as well, that not only do you have a nucleus which does a specific function, but you could break that into subnuclei as well with specific functions. And so therefore, there's this enormous degree of organization of the nervous system. It's not just this chaotic mixing of neurons. So, for example, here's an area which is involved in blood pressure, involving angiotensin, which is the major system by which we control our blood pressure. And since our blood pressure can drop when we're, say, dehydrated, etc., this then feeds into our sense of thirst and our drive to go get a drink. And so that's one subdivision of the preoptic nucleus. And there are others. And some can govern our sleep-awake cycle. So there's a signal known as adenosine, which causes us to be sleepy and fatigued. And so they act here. And so the hypothalamus is involved in that aspect of our daily cycle and the sleep-awake cycle as well. You see a sleeping bear there. And once again, there are other regions. Now, some regions of the hypothalamus are involved in sex drives, in behavior, which is attributed to sexual activity, and also to gender-specific behavior. I mean, that's easily studied in animals, or say birds, where males will sing a species-specific song or not. And so some of what I've said is far easier to show in non-human animals. But nevertheless, estrogen and testosterone bind to these the neurons in these areas. And so estrogen and testosterone, they bind to receptors and then bind to DNA where they activate genes. So one could ask, where in the brain are we making receptors for estrogen and testosterone? And the answer is not everywhere. And there's some areas where the receptors are most highly expressed. So these are the areas of the brain that sex hormones are targeting. So for example, there is a region of the medial preoptic nucleus where, say, male sexual behavior is regulated in all species studied, and lesions can abolish male sexual behavior. So once again, the hypothalamus has a great diversity of roles. Now, some of these areas, as they respond to the steroid hormones during say, pubertal development or earlier in life, could actually cause these areas to then have different sizes based on gender. And so if you look at a skeleton, you can make a very accurate guess on gender of the skeleton based on certain bones. Oh, look at the pubic arch, whether the two pubic bones form a 90-degree angle or a 120-degree angle. That allows me to conclude whether the skeleton was male or female. In the same way, one can identify the gender of brains. Now, obviously, we could speak of gender at multiple levels, but it is noticed that there are differences in multiple brain regions, not big differences and not most parts of the brain. But if you know where to look, these small nuclei of the hypothalamus or the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis or whatever, there is a slight gender difference. Or sometimes, I mentioned with the thalamus that intermediate mass is more likely to be absent in males, or the corpus callosum tends to be larger in females, et cetera. There are slight gender differences in the size of these areas. One could actually identify the gender fairly accurately by using sexually dimorphic regions of the brain. Lots of hormones affect neurons, including hormones which affect these regions here. And then these areas then can make hormones which affect other tissues, such as the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which affects the ovaries and testes, the oxytocin, which affects, oxytocin having lots of roles, from the contraction of uterine muscles to orgasm to the milk letdown. And so these areas of the hypothalamus very important. The hypothalamus, I'll get into hormones in just a little bit, but through hormones, it helps to regulate, body temperature by regulating the thyroid gland, etc. And so the heat of our body is regulated, and so thus we can, promote fevers when the hypothalamus decides to. We can control blood pressure and heart rate, and so not only are there specific nuclei within the hypothalamus, then there can be subnuclei within that preoptic nucleus, each of which does a specific task. And so, once again, there's this incredible organization of the nervous system in general, and we see that not only in that there are nuclei, but then also subnuclei. The paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus is regulating how much fluid there is in our body, pain perception, but it's also important in lactation. As I said, the oxytocin, which is produced in the hypothalamus, is the stimulus for milk letdown. And so the hypothalamus makes hormones which go into the blood here, and then pass through a portal system, and then signal the anterior pituitary, where it makes hormones which would say affect lactation and other things. And so neurons here in the paraventricular nucleus can then have axons going to this capillary bed, where they then release hormones which go into the capillary bed and then pass onward to the pituitary gland. Now, the hypothalamic control over the pituitary gland is really important and can be studied in greater depth later, but the hypothalamus tells the pituitary when to tell the thyroid to be active, or the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex then sends out the hormones of stress. So we often refer to what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, where we regulate our stress response from the hypothalamus, causing hormones to be released from the pituitary, which then cause hormones to be released from the adrenal cortex. So in conclusion, there are all of these nuclei within the hypothalamus. Once again, maybe the size of a thumbnail, all right, but it could be argued that no other part of the brain has as many vital functions crammed into as small an area. And here we see these distinct nuclei, some of which are involved in blood pressure or thermoregulation or emotions and drives, etc. And so certainly very important. And as pointed here, lesions which affect the hypothalamus can thus have diverse roles, because of all of the important roles that the hypothalamus has. Okay. So the diencephalon has three primary regions: the thalamus, which composes 80%, the hypothalamus underneath it, and then finally the pineal gland. The pineal gland is extremely important in our sleep-awake cycle and our light-dark cycles, because it releases a hormone, melatonin, primarily at night. And so it is a third region of the diencephalon, right? And so if you notice, here is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, here then is the pineal gland, where melatonin is made from its precursor tryptophan. And so the key here is that light is important, all right? Lots of living things depend on light or have different activities at night, versus during the day. And so how does the presence of light detected in the eye convert into a biological signal throughout the body? Well, then this is it, because when it is dark, the pineal gland takes tryptophan, converts that into serotonin, which then converts that into melatonin, which is then released into the blood as a hormone. And now all of the cells of the body can synchronize themselves because of this signal. Now, the pineal gland has a fascinating history, which I'll just mention here. But it was once a third eye, not like an eye for vision, but it was located at the top of the skull. It wasn't covered by brain in early mammals. There was what was called midbrain exposure, where the cerebrum covered the midbrain and then the pineal gland. And there was a hole in the parietal bones right above the pineal gland, so light came into the skull directly. And so there is a lot of similarities between the pinealocytes and rods in the eye. They can both make melatonin, although rods only make it for a locally acting thing. But they can also respond to light. Now, that's no longer the case of mammalian pinealocytes, but in more primitive vertebrates, the pineal gland does detect light directly. And so it seems that was the original thing that, the pineal gland, and here's the pineal gland from a human, and that the pineal gland, which sends information about the light-dark cycle, was actually getting light stimuli directly through a hole in the skull. That no longer happens. Our expansion of our brain, the cerebrum, has covered this, and so the eye communicates to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which then indirectly affects the pineal gland. So it gets its light-dark information from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but whether it be in humans or the opossum or this sheep or this pig, you can see the pineal gland, and it is in between the midbrain, and here you can see the superior and inferior colliculi at the midbrain, and then the thalamus. So notice there's a pair of each of these colliculi, but one single pineal gland. In humans, once again, there's a pair of superior and inferior colliculi, but only one single pineal gland there. And as I had said, the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus sends information to a ganglion, which then sends information to the pineal gland. And so the light which the hypothalamus detects is the source of the signal for whether the pineal gland then is informed to release melatonin. So the hypothalamus communicates there. And the pineal gland will put the hormone melatonin into blood. All these black fibers here are blood vessels. And so the pineal gland is very rich in blood, as you can see. So the melatonin, which is produced there, can be put into the blood. So the signal of light versus dark, all right, an external signal, can be converted to the internal signal of melatonin when it is dark, because the brain, like the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, signals the pineal gland to make this when it is dark. Now, this is important for so many reasons. The pineal gland isn't the only part of the body to make melatonin. Lots of parts of the body make melatonin, it turns out. But only the pineal gland makes it as a hormone, other than something that acts locally. So even in the eye, rods make melatonin, but it's not going into the blood where it will then have effects throughout the body. One of the reasons that this is so important is because of all of the diverse effects that melatonin has. Sleeping is actually very good for us, and we're actually, get sick when we don't sleep enough. And a lot of this is because of all of the positive things that melatonin does. Melatonin can decrease the spread of cancers and promote the programmed cell death in cancers. Melatonin affects how immune cells differentiate. It affects the balance of cytokine hormones in the immune system. It affects, it is itself an antioxidant. It affects whether we're making more Th1 or Th2 cells, which can affect allergy and other things. So there are so many great effects of melatonin, all right, on diverse systems, and I review them here, that this explains why melatonin can be so useful in treating certain disorders, all right, throughout the body, and then also a number of psychological disorders as well. But then also a concern. All right, even for me right now, because here I am making this video for my students at night, but notice behind me, I have a light on. Well, that's not normal. All right, my ancestors, when it was dark, they went to sleep. They slept longer, whereas we, when it gets dark, we can simply turn on the lights. But there's a consequence to that. As we sleep less, as we're exposed to more light, we make less melatonin. And this predisposes us to more illness, more cancer, etc. So it's actually a concern, the decrease in sleep we get, the exposure of all of this ambient light. So the pineal gland, which makes melatonin, very important. So I'm going to stop in just a second, but I hope I've made a couple of points. One is the diencephalon, doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as, say, the cerebrum. It is the third largest region of the brain, but its three subregions, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, have so much biological importance. And so much so that actually in this lecture, which is more on the nervous system, I should stop, all right, because I should leave other topics for another chapter on the endocrine system making hormones. So melatonin is a hormone. The hypothalamus controls the hormone release of the pituitary. And so actually the hypothalamus is a major part of the endocrine system. And the hypothalamus makes hormones on its own. It doesn't have to just influence the pituitary release of hormones. It can make its own oxytocin and ADH and other hormones, as you saw with feeding, which then affect all of these aspects of physiology. And so therefore, the diencephalon is a very important part of the brain. And this was an overview. Obviously, these playlists go into these topics in a little more detail.